There was a night I will never forget, and I do not say that lightly, because after decades in this work, most nights begin to carry the same weight, the same smell of sulfur and sweat, the same contorted faces, and the same ancient voices trying to negotiate their way out of the right. But this particular night was different. The person on the table, a man in his early 40s, had been brought to me after years of failed attempts by other priests, years of fragmented sessions and incomplete prayers, years of something persistent and deeply rooted that would not yield. I had performed exorcisms before where the demon resisted, because of generational curses, because of occult objects still in the home, because of insufficient sacramental preparation. I had seen resistance rooted in pacts made by ancestors, resistance tied to deliberate invitations spoken in moments of rage or desperation. But what I witnessed that night was something that stopped me cold. When I pressed the demon with the authority of the church and demanded it identify the legal right it held over this soul, it did not cite a pact. It did not cite an object. It cited a sin, one specific category of sin, habitually committed, never fully confessed, rationalized and minimized, and carried quietly for years inside the conscience of a man who attended Mass, received communion, and considered himself a faithful Catholic. And the demon said with absolute calm that it had every right to remain, because this man had given it a foothold through this sin, and had never truly surrendered it to God. I have spent over 20 years performing exorcisms under the authority and guidelines of the Catholic Church, and I tell you this not to shock you, not to entertain you, but because what I learned in that room has direct implications for your life, for the lives of everyone you love, and for the spiritual state of a culture that has almost entirely lost its understanding of the supernatural architecture of sin. I am a priest. I am a philosopher trained in the tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas. I have studied demonology, not as a curiosity but as a pastoral necessity, because you cannot fight an enemy you do not understand, and you cannot understand the enemy without understanding the nature of sin, which is the only true weapon the enemy has ever wielded against the human soul. What I want to tell you today is not a theory. It is not a theological speculation. It is something I have witnessed with my own eyes, something confirmed by the testimony of demons under duress of exorcism, confirmed by the consistent doctrine of the Church, and confirmed by the writings of saints who knew this territory far better than I do. The sin I am speaking about is the sin of habitual impurity, and I use that word not in a vague or generalized sense, but in the precise theological sense that St. Thomas uses when he writes about the vices that most effectively disorder the interior life and open the soul to influence from beneath. To understand why this particular sin gives demons power, you first have to understand what sin does at the level of the soul according to the Thomistic analysis. St. Thomas teaches, drawing directly from the metaphysics of Aristotle purified through the light of divine revelation, that the human soul has a rational faculty ordered toward God as its final end, and a sensitive appetite ordered toward the goods of the body and the senses. These two dimensions of the human person are not at war by nature. They were designed to operate in harmony, with reason governing appetite and appetite serving the higher purposes of the person. But sin, and especially habitual sin, inverts this hierarchy. It places the sensitive appetite in a position of command and reduces reason to the role of a servant, a rationalizer, a justifier of what the lower nature demands. When a person sins habitually, they are not simply committing an offense against God over and over again. They are actively restructuring the interior hierarchy of the soul. Before continuing with this story, listen to this message very carefully, because what you are about to hear could save your life today. Excess sugar in the blood can cause serious problems such as heart attack, stroke, vision loss, and even amputations. Type 2 diabetes silently damages the body, and many people only realize it when it's too late. At this moment, if your blood sugar is high, your life is at great risk right now. But there is a completely natural method that helps balance blood sugar levels and restore your health, leading to a better quality of life. This simple method has already helped thousands of people discover how to reduce excess sugar naturally and avoid type 2 diabetes. The information about this method is in a completely secret video, accessible to only a few people, and we don't know how long this video will remain available. If you want to discover how to naturally help control your blood sugar levels and protect your health today, congratulations, you have saved your life. Click the link in the first pinned comment now and watch the video before it's taken down. They are building brick by brick a disposition, what Thomas calls a habitus, a stable inclination that orients the faculties of the soul away from God and toward a created good that has been disordered into an end in itself. And what I have witnessed in the exorcism room is that this interior disordering creates in the spiritual realm something that functions like an unlocked door. The demons themselves have described it in these terms. They say there is a place in the person, a wound, a gap, a structural weakness created by long habitual consent to this kind of sin, and through that gap they exercise a legitimate claim of access that the rite of exorcism alone cannot fully close. The sin of impurity. And I want you to understand that I am speaking of what the moral tradition of the Church categorizes under the 6th and 9th commandments, including pornography, masturbation, fornication, adultery, and any deliberate consent to sexual thoughts or images outside of the sacramental covenant of marriage. This sin is singular in the disorder it introduces into the soul because it operates at the level of the imagination and the memory in a way that almost no other sin does. With the same intensity and persistence, St. Thomas notes that the pleasures associated with touch and the reproductive faculty are among the most powerful natural pleasures available to the human animal, and precisely because they are so powerful when they are disordered. When they are pursued outside their proper context, they enslave the imagination with an extraordinary tenacity. The man or woman who has fed this appetite habitually finds that the imagination becomes saturated with images, memories and fantasies that intrude upon prayer, upon the reception of the sacraments, upon the reading of Scripture, upon every attempt to orient the soul upward toward God. And this saturation is not merely a psychological phenomenon. In the spiritual warfare framework that the Church has always maintained, and that I have confirmed through direct pastoral experience, this saturation represents a persistent weakening of the spiritual senses, a blunting of the capacity for contemplation, and a practical severance of that interior silence in which God normally speaks to the soul. What the demon told me that night, and what I have heard confirmed in various forms across dozens of subsequent cases, is that the habitual practice of impurity, and specifically the habitual use of pornographic images, creates what can only be described in plain language as a spiritual stain on the imagination that serves as a gathering point for demonic attention. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. In the demonological tradition of the Church, which reaches back through the writings of Origen, through Cassian, through Evagrius Ponticus, through the great scholastics, and into the formal teaching of the Rituale Romanum, certain sins create what the tradition calls footholds, points of legitimate access through which the enemy establishes influence. The Council of Trent and the consistent magisterial tradition of the Church teach that mortal sin, by its very nature, deprives the soul of sanctifying grace, and where sanctifying grace is absent, the soul exists in a state of spiritual darkness that the enemy finds hospitable. But what I am telling you goes beyond the simple equation of mortal sin and demonic access. What I am telling you is that this particular category of sin, because of its nature, because of the way it operates on the imagination and the will, because of the way it creates a habitual disposition of interior consent to an image of another person being used as an object, rather than loved as a creature made in the image of God, this sin builds a kind of interior architecture that is uniquely suited to demonic habitation. Consider what is actually happening at the spiritual level when a person, even a baptized Catholic, even a person who goes to confession periodically, continues to return to pornography or to habitual impurity in any form. Each act of consent is, in the theological language of St. Thomas, an act of the will directed toward a disordered good. Each act deepens the habitus, the stable inclination toward that disordered good. Each act also, and this is the point I need you to hear with absolute seriousness, each act represents a practical statement about the hierarchy of goods in the soul. The person is saying, with their will, that this pleasure is worth more to them at this moment than the friendship of God, than the state of grace, than the dignity of the person being viewed or used, than the integrity of their own soul. And demons, who are pure intellects of extraordinary power and ancient experience, who understand the metaphysics of the human soul with a clarity that no fallen human can match, they read these acts of the will the way a legal mind reads a contract. Every habitual consent is a clause, every rationalization is a signature, every return after confession to the same sin without a firm purpose of amendment is an amendment to that contract, granting additional access. I have heard this described in precisely these terms during exorcisms, and while the testimony of demons must always be treated with extreme caution because they are liars by nature, on the question of their own legal rights, they have a strong motivation to be accurate, because exorcists are trained to strip away those rights one by one. And if a demon invents a right that does not exist, that invented claim can be dismantled. When a demon insists on a genuine right, it is because the right is real. The reason this particular sin occupies a unique position in the demonological hierarchy of access is also rooted in what the tradition teaches about the role of the imagination in the spiritual life. St. John of the Cross, who understood the interior life with a surgical precision that few have matched, writes extensively about the way the imagination can become a prison for the soul, a source of images and movements that distract from and obstruct the direct contemplative knowledge of God. He is writing primarily about natural attachments and natural images, but the principle applies with far greater force to the disordered images produced by habitual impurity. The person who has spent years filling the imagination with pornographic material has constructed within the interior life a gallery of images that does not simply disappear when they decide to stop. These images persist. They surface during prayer. They surface during the reception of the Eucharist. They surface in moments of silence when the soul is supposed to be most receptive to God. And in the experience of exorcism, these images function as points of contact, as interior locations where the demonic presence finds something familiar, something it has helped to build, something it regards with a kind of proprietary interest. I have had demons tell me under the pressure of the rite that they regard the imagination of a person saturated with pornographic images as their territory, as a space they have helped to decorate and which they have every intention of defending. There is a theological concept that I want to introduce here, because it is essential to understanding why confession, even frequent confession, does not always resolve this problem if it is not accompanied by something more. The concept is what the moral tradition calls the near occasion of sin. The Church, drawing from the consistent teaching of her moral theologians, teaches that the person who is genuinely repentant of a mortal sin is also obligated to take reasonable steps to avoid the occasions that predictably lead to that sin. This is not a peripheral requirement. It is constitutive of the firm purpose of amendment, without which sacramental absolution does not take effect. A person who confesses the habitual use of pornography and then returns to the same environment, the same devices, the same patterns of behavior, the same hours of isolation and idleness that predictably produce the temptation, that person has not made a firm purpose of amendment in the theological sense. They have made an emotional expression of regret, which is not the same thing. And what this means in the spiritual warfare framework is that the sacramental grace of confession has been obstructed at the level of the will. The absolution is valid in the objective order, the priest acting in persona. Christi has pronounced the words of the rite, but the subjective reception of the grace depends on the genuine disposition of the penitent, and a penitent who does not sincerely intend to remove the near occasions is not bringing a genuinely firm purpose of amendment to the sacrament. This is not my invention. This is standard moral theology, as taught by St. Alphonsus Liguori, as confirmed by the Council of Trent, as applied consistently in the confessional tradition of the Church. And it is precisely this gap, the gap between sacramental reception and genuine interior conversion, that demons exploit with the greatest skill and patience. I want to speak now about what I have seen happen when a person genuinely closes this door. When a person comes to confession with a genuine, informed, theologically adequate act of contrition, with a genuine, firm purpose of amendment that includes the concrete removal of the near occasions of this sin, with a genuine willingness to undergo the humiliation and the difficulty of interior purification, something changes in the exorcism room that is immediately perceptible. The demon becomes agitated not with the aggression it displays when it is being pressed, but with something closer to frustration, closer to the reaction of a legal adversary who has just learned that a key piece of evidence has been excluded from the case. I have seen demons that had resisted for months, that had endured the prayers of the ritual with apparent indifference, suddenly become destabilized when the person being exorcised made a genuine and thorough confession in the days preceding the session. The interior architecture changes, the foothold weakens. The legal claim that the demon had been invoking with such confidence begins to dissolve, not because the words of the exorcist have become more powerful, but because the spiritual state of the person has changed, because the grace of the sacrament has been received with genuine integrity, and the enemy no longer has the contractual access it previously enjoyed. This is one of the most important things I can tell you about the relationship between sacramental life and spiritual warfare. The power of the exorcist is entirely derivative. It flows from Christ through the Church, and it operates most effectively when the interior life of the person being delivered is cooperating with grace rather than obstructing it through habitual, unrepented sin. For those of you listening who do not consider yourselves in need of an exorcist, I want you to understand that everything I have described operates on a spectrum. Possession is the extreme end of a continuum that begins with temptation and moves through obsession and oppression before it reaches the point of full possession, and the vast majority of demonic influence in human lives operates at the level of obsession and oppression, which are far more common than possession and far less dramatic but not less destructive. The person who carries a habitual impurity, unconfessed and unresisted for years, is not safe from demonic influence simply because they are not rolling on the floor during Mass. They are carrying a wound in the imagination and the will that the enemy is actively working. Their prayer life is being subtly corrupted. Their capacity for authentic relationships is being quietly eroded. Their ability to receive the full grace available to them in the sacraments is being steadily obstructed. They may not know the name of the demon that is working on them. They may not experience dramatic supernatural phenomena, but the spiritual damage is real and it is cumulative, and it moves in one direction unless it is actively reversed through genuine repentance and sacramental healing. I say this not to frighten you with the power of the enemy. The enemy is nothing before the power of Christ. I say this because the greatest lie the enemy has ever told is the lie that what you do in private, in the darkness of a room with a screen, with a thought you quickly dismiss, has no consequences beyond the momentary. Every act of habitual impurity is leaving a mark, building a structure, writing a clause in a document that the enemy intends to present at the worst possible moment. The Church, in her wisdom and her mercy, has given us everything we need to close this door permanently. The sacrament of confession, received with genuine contrition and a genuine firm purpose of amendment, is the only instrument that fully and effectively dissolves the spiritual legal claims that habitual sin has created. But I want to be precise about what genuine confession requires in this context. It requires honesty about the frequency and the specific nature of the sin, because the confessor cannot offer adequate pastoral guidance if the penitent is vague or minimizing. It requires a concrete plan for removing the near occasions, not a vague intention to do better, but a concrete practical decision about the device, the time of night, the pattern of behavior, the isolation that makes the sin predictable. It requires, ideally, accountability to a confessor who can provide ongoing spiritual direction, because the habitus of impurity, once deeply established, is not dissolved in a single confession. It requires a sustained process of interior reordering that the tradition calls mortification, the gradual subjugation of the sensitive appetite to the governance of reason illuminated by faith. And it may require, in cases where the oppression is more severe, additional prayers, blessings, the use of sacramentals such as holy water and blessed salt, and in some cases, the direct intervention of a priest with experience in deliverance ministry. None of this is beyond the reach of any person listening to this. All of it is available through the ordinary life of the Church. The question is whether you are willing to bring this sin into the light of the confessional, to name it plainly, to accept the penance and the guidance, and to make the concrete decisions that constitute a genuine purpose of amendment. What I witnessed in that exorcism room when the demon finally yielded and the man was released was not simply the departure of an evil spirit. It was the restoration of an interior order that had been disrupted for decades. It was the return of a soul to the state for which it was created, ordered toward God, governed by reason, no longer carrying a wound that the enemy had been inhabiting and exploiting with patient malice. The man wept. Not with the theatrical weeping of someone performing an emotion, but with the quiet, exhausted, grateful weeping of someone who has just put down a weight they had been carrying so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. And that image, that man standing upright for the first time in years, that is what I want for you. Not fear, not condemnation, not despair about how long you have been carrying this or how deep the wound goes. The mercy of God is not a theological abstraction. It is a force more real and more powerful than anything the enemy can bring against you. But it requires your cooperation. It requires your honesty. It requires the courage to walk into a confessional and say the thing you have been saying to yourself in the dark for years, to say it out loud, to a priest acting in the person of Christ, and to mean it. The door that sin has opened can be closed. The legal claim that the enemy holds can be dissolved. The interior order that God designed for your soul can be restored. But it begins in the confessional, and it requires you to go.